Rhone Voss had chased the truth for years, but he never imagined it would lead him to the doorstep of Algren Vynn, the shadowy figure who controlled the city's darkest secrets. Lyda Toller knew more than she let on, but would she betray the very man who had protected her for so long? As Rhone closed in on the heart of the conspiracy, one thing was clear: someone would have to fall. But who would it be? Vynn, with his empire of power, or Rhone, determined to expose it all? The final game was about to begin, and no one would come out unscathed. Celesta Durnell had spent her career building a reputation as one of the most trusted and respected judges in the state. Her decisions were often harsh but fair, and her unwavering commitment to justice had earned her the nickname, the Iron Voice of Justice, in the media. No one questioned her integrity. She was known for her stern demeanor and her no-nonsense approach in the courtroom, but beyond that, she was a mystery. Few knew much about her personal life, and those who did rarely saw a hint of the cracks beneath her flawless exterior. On a foggy Tuesday morning, however, everything changed. The news broke that Celesta Durnell was dead, found at the bottom of a cliff near her remote lake house, the victim of what appeared to be a tragic accident. Her car was parked at the top of the cliff, its door left ajar. The scene seemed straightforward: a woman out for a solitary walk, a slip, and a fall. But one detail didn't sit right with the authorities, and soon, that detail would lead them down a dark and twisted path. A single shoe, a black stiletto heel, was found nearly 200 feet away from her body. It was strange. If Celesta had fallen, why had she lost just one shoe? And why was it so far from where her body was found? The investigators quickly ruled out foul play, assuming it was a freak accident, but something in the back of their minds kept nagging at them. No one could explain how a woman as composed and careful as Celesta would suddenly make such a fatal misstep. The local authorities were quick to close the case, convinced the death was an accident. But one person refused to let the matter rest: Rhone. Tavik, a former private investigator who had recently retired after a troubled and traumatic career. Rhone had been living in seclusion, hiding from a past that was full of mistakes, regrets, and failed cases. But when he saw the news, something about it caught his attention. Celesta Durnell's death didn't add up. He reached out to the police, anonymously, offering his services to investigate what he believed was a murder disguised as an accident. The police, reluctant at first to reopen the case, eventually agreed to let Rhone take a look. It was a long shot, but Rhone had an intuition. His instincts had served him well in the past, and he was sure that there was more to this death than met the eye. Rhone drove to the lake house, carefully examining the area surrounding the cliff. The fog still hung in the air, thick and heavy, making everything feel eerily silent. He took a slow walk along the edge of the cliff, noting the broken branches, the uneven ground, and the overgrown brush that lined the path. But it was the small things that caught his attention: the scuff marks in the dirt, a patch of crushed grass, and the faintest traces of what appeared to be dragged footprints. He turned his focus to the lake house itself. The front door was slightly ajar, the lock untouched, and the windows sealed shut. Inside, the house was as pristine as ever, untouched by time or decay. Rhone walked through the house, noting the lack of personal belongings. There were no family pictures, no knickknacks, nothing to suggest that this place had ever been a home. It was sterile, almost clinical. The only sign of life was a collection of legal books on the shelves, the pages yellowed with age. His mind raced as he began piecing together the puzzle. Why would someone like Celesta, who had lived a life of such precision and order, leave the house in such a hurry, let alone go for a walk in the foggy, treacherous conditions? Rhone's suspicions grew stronger. There had to be something Celesta was hiding, a secret that someone was willing to kill to keep buried. Back at his apartment, Rhone combed through the records he had obtained on Celesta's career. Her cases were flawless, and she had been a relentless enforcer of the law. But there was one case that stood out. A high-profile trial from 5 years earlier that had ended in an unexpected and controversial verdict. The case had been sealed, and the defendant, a powerful business tycoon, had walked free despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Rhone's interest deepened. He discovered that Celesta had been the judge overseeing the case, and something about the way it had been handled didn't sit right. Rhone couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection between Celesta's death and the sealed trial. The more he dug into her past, the more questions he uncovered, and the deeper he was drawn into a web of secrets, corruption, and betrayal. But it wasn't just Celesta's case files that he found. Hidden within her personal belongings was a series of encrypted emails, messages that hinted at a shadowy figure pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The name was familiar to Rhone, someone from his past. It was a name he never thought he would hear again. Rhone knew this wasn't just an accident. Celesta Durnell had been murdered, and the killer was someone with a deep connection to her. Someone who had orchestrated her fall from grace. And now Rhone was determined to find out who it was, no matter what it took. As the fog outside thickened, so did the mystery surrounding Celesta's death. Rhone had no idea just how far down the rabbit hole he was about to go, but one thing was clear. He had just begun to unravel a dark, twisted story that no one had ever suspected. Rhone's investigation into Celesta Durnell's death took a darker turn as he began to sift through the details of her life. He had always known that the judicial system could be full of secrets, but the more he uncovered about Celesta, the more he realized just how deeply she had been entangled in a web of corruption and deception. The judge who had seemed so untouchable, so incorruptible, was not the person everyone had thought she was. There were cracks in her perfect facade, and Rhone was determined to expose them. He began by focusing on the sealed trial that had caught his attention, a high-profile case that had left the public and the legal community buzzing for months. Celesta had been the judge overseeing the case of a wealthy, influential businessman named Clifford Ralston, who had been accused of embezzling millions of dollars from a charity foundation. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, the case ended in a surprise verdict. Ralston was acquitted, and the case was sealed from the public eye. The decision had raised eyebrows, and rumors had swirled about the possibility of bribery, but no one had been able to prove anything. Rhone knew that the key to understanding Celesta's death lay within that trial. He made his way to the courthouse, where the trial had been held, hoping to find any clues that might shed light on what had really happened. The courthouse was a grand, imposing building with its marble columns and polished floors, but it felt cold and oppressive to Rhone, as though it was hiding something. He had to be careful. The people involved in this case were powerful, and any wrong move could make him a target. The courthouse was quieter than usual when Rhone arrived, the halls nearly empty except for a few cleaning staff and security guards. He slipped into the records office where the files for the case had been kept. He knew it would be a long shot to find anything useful, but he had to try. Rhone spent hours going through the paperwork, each page revealing more layers of the case but nothing concrete. Then, buried deep within the files, he found something that made his blood run cold. A letter from Celesta to a woman named Darla Wren. Darla Wren was a name Rhone had not encountered in his initial research, but as soon as he read the letter, he realized how important she was. Darla Wren was Celesta's courtroom clerk, a quiet woman who had worked behind the scenes for years. The letter was a strange one, filled with coded language and cryptic references, but it was clear that Celesta had been reaching out to Darla for help. In it, Celesta spoke of feeling trapped, of being caught in a system that was beyond her control. She hinted at a powerful group of people who had been manipulating the outcome of her cases, including the Ralston trial. Rhone's heart raced as he read the letter. It was clear that Celesta had been struggling with something far darker than anyone had realized. She had been trying to expose the corruption within the judicial system, but she had been working in the shadows, afraid of what would happen if she came forward. The letter was a plea for help, but it was also a confession. Celesta had known that she was being used, but she had been too scared to do anything about it. Rhone's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. He knew that Darla Wren was the key to understanding what had really happened in the Ralston case, and he needed to find her. But when he tried to track her down, he discovered that Darla had disappeared. Her apartment had been emptied, and there was no record of her anywhere. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The more Rhone dug into Darla's past, the more questions he found. She had been close to Celesta, but her background was full of strange gaps and inconsistencies. It seemed as though Darla had always been in the background, working quietly behind the scenes, but now it was clear that she had been more involved than anyone had realized. Rhone felt a growing sense of unease. Darla wasn't just a bystander. She was part of something much bigger, and the more he uncovered, the more dangerous things were becoming. Then, Rhone found something else, something that made him freeze in his tracks. Hidden among Darla's personal effects was a note, a single sentence written in bold red ink. Karis Molden knows everything. Rhone's heart skipped a beat. Karis Molden was a name he hadn't heard in years. Karis had once been a low-profile crime scene cleaner, but he had disappeared after being linked to an underground network of criminals. His name had been associated with some of the darkest corners of the city, and Rhone knew that if Karis was involved in this, it meant that the stakes were far higher than he had imagined. Rhone's thoughts raced as he realized that he was getting closer to uncovering the truth. Celesta's death was no accident. It was part of something much larger, something that had been carefully planned for years. And now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Rhone knew that he was in over his head. He had opened a door to a world of corruption and betrayal, and there was no turning back. With a renewed sense of urgency, Rhone set out to find Karis Molden. He had no idea what he would uncover when he finally tracked him down. But one thing was certain. He was getting closer to the heart of the mystery, and it was only a matter of time before everything would be revealed. Rhone's search for Karis Molden took him into the darkest corners of the city, places he hadn't ventured in years. Karis was a name shrouded in mystery, one whispered about in hushed tones among those who knew the underworld of organized crime. He had once been a trusted figure, an efficient crime scene cleaner with connections to some of the most dangerous people in the city. But after his name surfaced in a series of unsolved murders, Karis had vanished. No one had seen or heard from him in over 5 years, and the authorities had assumed he was dead, another victim of the criminal network he had worked for. But now, as Rhone's investigation deepened, Karis's name was reappearing, and it was clear that he had ties to something far bigger than anyone had imagined. Rhone followed every lead, from underground networks to shadowy contacts, each step taking him closer to Karis, but also putting him at greater risk. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous things became. Rhone could feel the weight of something looming in the background, something far more sinister than just Celesta's death. His first breakthrough came when he tracked down a former associate of Karis, a man named Otto Klein, a petty thief who had been in and out of prison for most of his life. Otto had worked alongside Karis in the past, helping to cover up various criminal activities, but he had always remained in the shadows. Rhone found him holed up in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of town, his face a mixture of fear and exhaustion. When Rhone showed up at Otto's door, the man nearly jumped out of his skin. He was clearly on edge, paranoid about something or someone, but he reluctantly agreed to talk. His story was fragmented, and it took a while for Rhone to piece it all together. But eventually, it became clear that Karis had become involved in something much darker than Rhone had imagined. Karis had been working with a group of powerful figures who were involved in manipulating the judicial system. They used their influence to control verdicts, tamper with evidence, and ensure that certain criminals went free while others were quietly disposed of. This shadowy network had been operating under the radar for years, and Celesta Durnell had become entangled in their web. Otto revealed that Karis had been the one to clean up after some of the network's most brutal operations. When things went wrong, when a case became too high profile, Karis would be called in to erase all traces of the crime. He was meticulous, professional, and ruthless in his work, and he knew exactly how to make a body disappear without a trace. But over time, Karis had begun to question the people he was working for. He had seen too many innocent lives destroyed, too many lives ruined for the benefit of a powerful few. Karis had started to talk about leaving the network, but before he could act on his plans, he disappeared. Otto believed that Karis was running, hiding from the very people he had helped. But it seemed Rhone's investigation had brought Karis back into the picture, whether he liked it or not. Rhone knew he was getting closer to the truth, but he also knew that he was treading dangerous ground. The network Karis had been involved with was far-reaching, and the people behind it were not afraid to use violence to protect their secrets. Otto had warned him to back off, to stop digging into things that were better left buried, but Rhone was past the point of turning back. Celesta Durnell's death had been just the tip of the iceberg, and the more he uncovered, the more he realized that the system she had worked for had been rotten to its core. She had been a part of something much bigger, something that had likely cost her her life. As Rhone continued his search, he found Karis's trail. It led him to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city, a place that had once been used for illicit activities, but was now eerily quiet. Rhone approached cautiously, his heart racing as he neared the entrance. He wasn't sure what he would find inside, but he knew that it was the key to unraveling the mystery. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost oppressive. Rhone moved through the shadows, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of Karis. He had learned enough to know that Karis was a master at covering his tracks, so it was no surprise that there was no immediate sign of him. But Rhone wasn't looking for Karis. He was looking for evidence, anything that might tie him to Celesta's death and the network she had been investigating. It didn't take long for Rhone to find what he was looking for. In a corner of the warehouse, hidden beneath a pile of old crates, he discovered a locked metal box. He pried it open, and inside, he found a collection of files, photographs, and documents, everything Karis had been keeping hidden. The files contained information on the network's operations, names of powerful people involved, and even a series of photographs that depicted Celesta Durnell, Garrett Flynn, and several other key figures in compromising situations. Rhone's mind raced as he sifted through the contents of the box. This was it, the evidence he needed to expose the network and bring the truth to light. But as he flipped through the final stack of photographs, one image caught his attention, a picture of Karis standing next to a man whose face was obscured by shadows. The man was holding a stack of papers, and written on one of them was a name: Algren Vynn. Rhone's blood ran cold. Algren Vynn was a former judge, a mentor to Celesta Durnell, and someone Rhone had never imagined would be involved in this web of corruption. But now, with the pieces starting to come together, Rhone realized that Vynn was at the heart of it all. He had orchestrated the entire operation, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Rhone knew that his time was running out. The people behind this network were closing in, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But Rhone wasn't going to back down. He had come too far, and now he was closer than ever to exposing the truth. And nothing would stop him from seeing this through to the end. Rhone could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him as he stared at the photograph of Algren Vynn. The image was a revelation, the final piece of a puzzle that had seemed too complicated to solve. Algren Vynn was not just a mentor to Celesta Durnell. He was the mastermind behind the criminal network that had manipulated the judicial system for years, the very system Celesta had sworn to uphold. Rhone now understood the full scope of the conspiracy, and it was more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He knew he had to move quickly. If Vynn was involved, then he was deeply entrenched in a web of power and corruption that extended far beyond anything Rhone had encountered in his career. Rhone had always been an outsider to the world of high-level corruption, but now he had become an unwilling player in a game that could destroy everything he had worked for. The next step was clear. He needed to find Algren Vynn. Rhone had no illusions about how difficult this would be. Vynn was a man of immense influence, and his connections were as vast as they were dangerous. Every move Rhone made now would put him further into the crosshairs of people who wouldn't hesitate to kill him if it meant keeping their secrets safe. Rhone began by revisiting the files he had found in the warehouse. There had to be something, some piece of information that would lead him to Vynn. He pored over the documents, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations, hoping to find some clue that would point him in the right direction. As he sifted through the papers, something stood out. A series of encrypted phone numbers and addresses that didn't appear in any of the official records. One of them was linked to a private estate just outside the city. Rhone knew this was no coincidence. The estate was owned by a shell company, but the property was registered under a different name, one that kept popping up in his research. Lyda Toller. Lyda was a former associate of Vynn's, a woman with a reputation for handling delicate matters. She had been involved in several cases of financial mismanagement and fraud, always operating in the background, never directly implicated. But Rhone's gut told him she was tied to Vynn. She was the key to finding him. With little more than the address and a hunch, Rhone set out to find Lyda Toller. The estate was located on the outskirts of town, in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. The mansion was large and imposing, hidden behind high gates and a dense thicket of trees. As Rhone approached, he took a moment to survey the area. He knew this wouldn't be easy. People like Lyda Toller didn't leave loose ends, and she would never allow herself to be caught in the middle of an investigation. But Rhone was relentless, and he wasn't about to back down now. He parked his car a few blocks away and approached the estate on foot, using the cover of the trees to stay out of sight. As he got closer, he noticed something odd. 2 black SUVs parked at the front entrance. They didn't look like the vehicles of a wealthy socialite. They were sleek, discreet, and had the look of vehicles used by people who didn't want to be noticed. Rhone's heart raced. He knew he was on the right track. The presence of those cars meant that something was happening at the estate, something important. Rhone continued to move closer, carefully making his way around the back of the property. He found a small, concealed door at the rear of the mansion, which was slightly ajar. It seemed like an opportunity too good to pass up. He slipped inside, moving quickly and quietly through the corridors, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The interior of the mansion was grand but cold, decorated with an unsettling lack of warmth or personality. It felt like a place built for secrecy, an environment designed to make people feel small, insignificant. Rhone crept through the hallways, following the faint sound of voices. It wasn't long before he reached a large, dimly lit room at the end of the corridor. Inside, he could make out the silhouettes of 2 people sitting at a table, deep in conversation. One of them was Lyda Toller. Rhone's breath caught in his throat as he leaned in closer, trying to catch every word. The conversation was difficult to hear, but he could make out fragments of sentences. Lyda was speaking about a final phase and securing the last piece. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as if she were discussing something entirely mundane. But the words she was using hinted at something much more sinister. This wasn't just a conversation about business deals or finances. This was about keeping secrets safe, about ensuring that the network remained untouched. Rhone's mind raced. He knew this was his chance. If he could just get closer, gather more information, he might be able to uncover where Vynn was hiding. But as he stepped forward, his foot brushed against a loose floorboard, and the creaking sound echoed through the room. Lyda's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes narrowing as she searched the darkness. Rhone froze, barely breathing, praying that she hadn't seen him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. He could hear the beat of his own heart, the tension thick in the air. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Lyda turned away and resumed her conversation, her attention seemingly back on her companion. Rhone exhaled in relief but knew it wouldn't be long before they figured out he was there. He had to leave, and he had to do it fast. As quietly as he had entered, Rhone slipped out of the room and back into the shadows, retracing his steps to the back door. His mind raced with the implications of what he had just overheard. This wasn't just about Celesta Durnell anymore. It was about something far bigger, a final phase that could change everything. Rhone's pursuit of Algren Vynn was closer than ever. But now, it was clear that the stakes had escalated. Whatever was happening at Lyda Toller's estate was just the beginning, and Rhone was about to find out just how far the corruption went. Rhone's heart pounded as he left the estate, the heavy air of danger closing in around him. Every step he took away from Lyda Toller's mansion felt like an act of defiance against the overwhelming odds stacked against him. He knew he was treading on thin ice, that his every move was being watched by people far more powerful and dangerous than he had anticipated. But Rhone couldn't back down now. The pieces of the puzzle were all but in place, and the final confrontation was imminent. He had to find Algren Vynn, expose the corruption, and ensure that the truth came to light, no matter the cost. As Rhone made his way back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, the shadows seemed to move just a little too quickly, a little too deliberately. He quickened his pace, trying to shake the unsettling sense that someone, or something, was closing in. It was only when he reached his car and slid into the driver's seat that he allowed himself a moment to breathe. But even then, the sense of unease didn't leave him. He drove through the city's quiet streets, trying to collect his thoughts. Lyda's conversation had confirmed his worst fears. The network he had been uncovering wasn't just a rogue element within the justice system. It was a carefully orchestrated machine designed to control every aspect of law and order. Algren Vynn, the man behind it all, had been playing a dangerous game for years. And now, with Rhone hot on his trail, Vynn would do anything to protect his empire. Rhone knew that finding Vynn wasn't going to be easy. The man had been clever, hiding behind layers of protection and using people like Lyda to keep himself shielded from the authorities. But Rhone had something they didn't: determination. He couldn't let fear stop him now. Every lead he followed, every corner he turned, brought him closer to the truth. And if it meant putting his life on the line to expose it, then so be it. As he reached his office, Rhone was greeted by an unexpected visitor. A man stood at the door, his face partially obscured by the brim of a hat. His presence was unnerving, and Rhone immediately felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was something about this man that didn't sit right with him. "Detective Rhone," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. "We need to talk." Rhone's instincts flared. He could sense that this wasn't a friendly visit, but he kept his composure. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped into Rhone's office and closed the door behind him. Rhone remained standing, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the stranger. The man's movements were deliberate, controlled, like someone who was used to being in charge. "I'm here because I know what you're after," the man continued, "and I think you'll find that you're running out of time." Rhone's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if this was a threat or an attempt to offer some kind of warning, but either way, he wasn't about to let his guard down. "What do you want?" Rhone asked, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. The man smiled faintly. "I'm not here to stop you, Detective. I'm here to help you. But you have to understand something. There are forces at play here that go beyond what you can imagine. Algren Vynn has built an empire. And if you think exposing him is going to be as easy as you think, then you're mistaken." People like him don't fall easily, and they don't go down without a fight. Rhone felt a cold chill settle over him. The man's words weren't comforting. In fact, they only heightened the sense of danger that had been hanging over him ever since he had uncovered the truth about Celesta Durnell's death. He had no idea who this man was or what his true motivations were, but there was one thing Rhone knew for certain. This man was connected to Vynn's network. He was either one of them, or he was playing a much larger game than Rhone could comprehend. "I don't need your help," Rhone said firmly. "I'm going after Vynn. I'm going to expose everything he's been doing, and I won't stop until I do." The man's expression softened for a moment, almost as though he were pitying Rhone. "That's where you're wrong, Detective. You don't understand. The people you're dealing with, they have resources, they have power, and they will stop at nothing to protect themselves." Rhone's fists clenched. He wasn't about to be intimidated. He had already risked too much. To turn back now, he had come too far, and the truth was too important. "I'll take my chances," Rhone said, his voice colder now. "If you're not going to help, then you can leave." The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly, as though he had expected Rhone's response. "You're making a mistake, Detective, but I won't stop you. Just remember, when everything comes crashing down, don't say I didn't warn you." With that, the man turned and walked out of Rhone's office, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread. Rhone stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't know if the man had been trying to warn him, threaten him, or manipulate him. But it didn't matter. Rhone had made his decision. He was going after Vynn, and nothing was going to stop him. The next few days were a blur of planning and strategizing. Rhone worked tirelessly, following up on every lead, piecing together the connections between the people involved in the network. But as he closed in on Vynn, it became clear that the closer he got, the more dangerous things became. Someone was watching his every move. He could feel it. And with each passing hour, the walls were closing in on him. It was only when Rhone finally tracked Vynn down to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town that he knew the moment of truth had arrived. This was it, the final confrontation. Rhone had come too far to back down now. The stakes had never been higher, and he had no choice but to face whatever awaited him inside.